He thought she was just another gold digger in first class, until he found out who she really was. The first-class cabin smelled of leather and money, soft conversations humming in the background, accompanied by the occasional clink of a champagne glass. Overhead bins clicked shut as passengers settled in, adjusting designer bags and expensive watches. Nathan Kessler barely glanced up from his phone as he dropped into seat 3A, a window seat. Exactly how he liked it. He exuded the kind of confidence that came from years of closing deals and sitting in boardrooms where people laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. He ordered a scotch before takeoff, loosening his tie as if to silently declare to everyone that he was the kind of man who belonged in first class. The flight from Dallas to Tampa was just under 3 hours. Not long, but long enough for him to enjoy the perks of luxury travel. He had no intention of working, not when there were premium drinks and the opportunity to size up the cabin. That's when he noticed her. A blonde woman seated just a few rows ahead, her profile partially visible as she scrolled through something on her iPad. There was something about her, something familiar but not enough to place. Maybe she was a local news anchor, a C-list actress, someone who'd had her 15 minutes and was desperately clinging to the last few seconds. He smirked, nudging the man in the seat next to him, a mild-mannered traveler who had the misfortune of sitting beside someone who loved the sound of his own voice. Ever notice how some people think money can buy class? Nathan mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The man beside him gave a polite, non-committal chuckle, keeping his eyes on the in-flight magazine. He wasn't interested in conversation, but Nathan didn't need an audience to keep talking. She looks familiar, he went on, tilting his head. Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type, big hair, expensive handbag, and no idea how to blend in. His words floated into the space around him, catching the ears of those nearby. A few glanced in his direction, but the woman remained focused on her iPad, either unaware or uninterested in his commentary. That didn't sit well with him. People like her were supposed to care what men like him thought. The plane began taxiing, and the flight attendant made her final rounds, checking seat belts and collecting empty glasses. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored with the flight before it had even begun. He watched as the blonde woman politely handed off her drink and smiled at the attendant, her posture composed, her demeanor calm. It irritated him. There was a quiet confidence about her, an ease that suggested she wasn't the kind of woman who would be rattled by side comments or sideways glances. That made Nathan double down. He shifted, making sure his voice carried just enough. She must have married well, he mused, shaking his head as if he found the entire thing amusing. That's usually how these stories go. Third husband, maybe fourth. Plastic surgeons on speed dial. It's always the same. This time there was a noticeable shift in the air. The businessman in the seat across the aisle cast a glance at him, brief but pointed. The flight attendant hesitated ever so slightly as she moved past. Even the man sitting next to him exhaled quietly, as if he wished himself anywhere else. Nathan of course didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He reached for his scotch as the plane lifted off, tapping his fingers against the glass. 3 hours, plenty of time to entertain himself. But what he didn't realize was that his entertainment was about to come at his own expense. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Nathan resumed his commentary. He wasn't the kind of man who let things go, especially not when he felt ignored. The woman, whoever she was, had barely glanced up, had given zero indication that she had heard him or cared. That didn't sit right with him. So he leaned in. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, he flagged down the flight attendant with an exaggerated wave, as if he were at a bar rather than sitting in first class. "Another scotch," he said, handing over his empty glass. Then, just to be that guy, he nodded toward the blonde woman. "And whatever she's having too. On me." It was a test, a way to get a reaction. Maybe she'd laugh, shake her head, indulge him in a bit of harmless back and forth. Women like her loved attention, at least that's what he assumed. But the flight attendant didn't so much as blink. "She's fine, sir," she said smoothly, taking his glass and moving away before he could press further. Nathan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. So she was one of those, the kind of woman who carried herself like she was better than everyone else, who acted as if she was above small talk. He turned back to his reluctant seatmate, who had opened a book in a clear attempt to avoid conversation. "You ever notice that?" Nathan said, tapping the armrests between them. "How some people walk around like they're the main character in life, like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie." The man gave him a quick glance before returning to his book. "Haven't really thought about it." Nathan grinned. He wasn't going to let this go. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, keeping his voice at that perfect volume. Not too loud to be accused of being rude, but just enough for the people around him to hear. "She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name on favors. Some senator's ex-wife, maybe. Or one of those lawyers who loves the camera, but couldn't win a case to save her life." He let the words linger, waiting for a shift, a reaction. Anything that would let him know he was getting under her skin. Nothing. The blonde woman remained composed, scrolling through her tablet like he wasn't worth acknowledging. Like he wasn't even there. Nathan exhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting his watch in irritation. "Not even a glance," he muttered. "Guess she's too important for the rest of us." A few rows back, a woman in a navy pantsuit exchanged a knowing look with her seatmate. Across the aisle, an older gentleman glanced up from his newspaper, one brow slightly raised. People were noticing him now. But Nathan, in his arrogance, assumed they were on his side, that they found her just as ridiculous as he did. And that's what made him double down. He leaned forward, resting his elbow on the armrest, dropping his voice just slightly, like he was sharing some great insight. "Mark my words," he said, smirking. "She's going to post something later about how exhausting travel is. Probably complain about manspreading or some nonsense. Women like her love playing the victim. But I guarantee you—" "Excuse me, sir." The voice was calm, firm. Nathan turned his head, expecting the flight attendant again. Instead, he found himself looking at the blonde woman herself. For the first time, she had turned fully toward him, her expression unreadable. There was no anger, no irritation, just a look. A quiet, measured look that made Nathan suddenly hyper-aware of how his own voice had been carrying. For the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of something uncomfortable, something foreign. But he shook it off. He met her gaze, waiting for her to say something, to scold him, argue with him. Anything that would justify his behavior. But she didn't. She just studied him for a moment, then gave the faintest, most unreadable smile before turning back to her tablet, like he wasn't worth her time. And for the first time, Nathan felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Nathan sat in his seat, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Even the flight attendant, who had just passed by with a tray, was keeping an eye on him out of the corner of her eye. The realization made his stomach tighten. They weren't laughing with him. He exhaled sharply through his nose, sitting back in his seat. Fine. Let them judge. People were always so uptight these days, acting like a little light-hearted teasing was some kind of personal attack. He hadn't said anything that bad. He drained the last of his scotch, setting the glass down a little harder than necessary. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, the flight attendant spoke. "Miss Bondi, would you like another beverage?" Nathan barely registered the words at first. It wasn't until the blonde woman, Pam, looked up and politely declined that his brain caught up. Bondi. Pam Bondi. His entire body tensed, fingers curling slightly on the armrest. Now it made sense. Former Attorney General of Florida. Nationally known. Politically connected. A legal bulldog who had gone head-to-head with some of the most powerful people in the country. A woman who, oh God, wasn't just familiar because she had been on television. She had been on television because she was the kind of woman who could ruin a person's life with a single phone call. Nathan's throat went dry. He stole another glance at her, but she wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. And now so did he. For the first time in the entire flight, Nathan had nothing to say. He swallowed hard, his mind racing as if searching for an escape hatch. Pam Bondi. He could hear the name echoing in his head, each syllable unraveling his confidence one thread at a time. His fingers tightened around the armrest. How had he not recognized her sooner? Of course he had seen her before, on news broadcasts, at press conferences, in courtroom footage that had aired on every major network. She had gone toe-to-toe with corporations, tangled with politicians, and won. And now he was sitting a few feet away from her. Realizing that all the smug, half-whispered remarks he had been making had landed in the absolute worst place possible. The blood drained from his face. He glanced around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of how many people had been within earshot. The older gentleman across the aisle, the business traveler typing on his laptop, the flight attendant who had heard everything. Had he just mocked a former attorney general in front of an entire first-class cabin? Nathan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He had to fix this. He turned his head slightly toward her, plastering on a smile that felt stiff at the edges. I thought you looked familiar, he said, forcing a light chuckle. Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty. Pam didn't react. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. She just continued reading her tablet as if he were nothing more than background noise. Nathan's stomach twisted. She had heard every word. She had registered every comment. And she had decided he wasn't worth the effort. That was worse than if she had called him out, much worse. If she had turned and fired back, at least he could have argued, could have played it off, made a joke out of it. But this was deliberate. She had made a choice to let him drown in his own embarrassment. Nathan shifted again, pretending to adjust his seatbelt as he desperately tried to think of something, anything, to say that would smooth things over. I actually followed some of your cases back in the day. He tried, keeping his tone light. You've had quite the career. Nothing. No glance. No acknowledgement. Nathan's skin prickled. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw, suddenly feeling very aware of how long this flight still had to go. It was one thing to be embarrassed for a few minutes. It was another to be trapped at 35,000 feet with no escape, sitting in the tension he had created. And just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, the flight attendant returned. "Another drink, sir?" she asked. Nathan opened his mouth, then hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but suddenly the idea of another scotch didn't sit right. "Just water," he muttered. The flight attendant nodded, taking his empty glass. And that's when he noticed it, the tiniest flicker of amusement in Pam Bondi's eyes. She hadn't turned her head, hadn't spoken, but in that split second, he knew she had been watching. She had been waiting. And now she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. For the first time in a long time, Nathan Kessler understood exactly how it felt to be small. He sat rigidly in his seat, the weight of his own words pressing down on him like an anvil. How had he let this happen? He was usually good at reading people, at controlling conversations, at making sure he never ended up looking like the fool. But here he was, trapped in his own arrogance, staring at the back of a woman's head who had dismantled him without saying a single word. His mind scrambled for an exit strategy. Should he apologize? Make a joke? Pretend none of it happened? He glanced at the other passengers, subtly gauging the damage. The businessman across the aisle wasn't looking at him anymore. But the slight smirk on his lips told Nathan he had been watching all along. The flight attendant was more professional about it, offering him a neutral glance as she set down his water. Nathan cleared his throat. "Thanks." She nodded and moved on. And that was somehow worse because she didn't pity him. She didn't care. He wasn't important enough to care about. He shifted his gaze back to Pam, who was still reading, still unfazed, still carrying herself like someone who had already moved on. And maybe that's what made it hurt the most. She wasn't angry. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had decided he wasn't worth a second thought. Nathan hated that feeling. And it was his own fault. His fingers tapped against the tray table. Restless, agitated. He thought about the stories he'd read about her, her legal battles, her high-profile cases, the people who had tried to intimidate her and failed. And he, like an idiot, had thought she would care about his opinion. Nathan exhaled slowly. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was the fact that he had nowhere to go. But for the first time in a long time, he started thinking about what kind of person he had become. He had spent years walking into rooms like he owned them, speaking like his words carried more weight than anyone else's, assuming that his version of reality was the only one that mattered. But here, in this moment, he wasn't the powerful one. He wasn't the one with control. And he didn't like how that felt. The plane hummed softly around him. The cabin settled into quiet conversation and occasional clinking glasses. Nathan picked up his water and took a sip, staring blankly at the seat in front of him. Maybe this was the kind of lesson people like him didn't learn until they had no choice. Maybe this was exactly what he deserved. Nathan stared out the window, watching the sky stretch endlessly beyond the wing. The vastness of it suddenly made him feel small, insignificant. It was a foreign feeling, one he wasn't sure he liked. For years, he had carried himself like the center of the universe. People laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. They nodded along when he spoke, even when he had nothing of value to say. He was used to commanding attention. But today he had been reminded of something he had long forgotten. Respect wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about character. Pam Bondi had done nothing to put him in his place, because she didn't have to. She had let his own arrogance do the job for her. Nathan took another sip of water, feeling the coolness settle in his throat. It wasn't scotch, but maybe that was for the best. For once, he needed to sit with his thoughts without drowning them in alcohol. He glanced at her again, half expecting her to finally turn, to throw him a glance of satisfaction. But she didn't. She was done with him. She had been done with him the moment she realized what kind of man he was. That realization twisted in his chest. It wasn't often that someone like him had to face himself, had to sit in the discomfort of knowing he had been the fool in the room. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time he started listening more and talking less. Maybe it was time he started thinking before assuming he knew everything. As the plane began its descent into Tampa, Nathan realized something. This wasn't about Pam Bondi. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be from here on out.